His wife divorced him to marry a wealthy doctor, and had no idea that her quiet, overlooked husband owned the $38 billion medical empire the doctor's entire career depended on. She staged the divorce like a performance. She rented a moving truck. She let her mother direct it, let her brother film it, and let the doctor wait at the curb in his car while she handed her husband a box of his own belongings on the front porch of the home they had shared for 7 years. The neighbors watched. A church mother down the street stood at her mailbox and didn't move, and while all of that was happening, while his wife was performing her liberation for an audience, her husband stood in the doorway holding a set of keys he hadn't looked at in 8 months, 14 keys on a worn brass ring, each one labeled in his late great-uncle's handwriting. He didn't know yet what those keys unlocked, but he was about to find out. What happened next didn't just cost that doctor his career. It cost him his surgical privileges, his practice, his income, his reputation, and the future he had convinced a whole family to bet on. And it happened because one quiet man finally made a phone call. The question is, how does a building manager from Decatur end up holding $38 billion over the head of the man who took his wife? If you already know this one is going to be good, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss a story. We drop new videos every week. Now drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? I want to see exactly where in the world this story is landing. Now let me take you all the way back to a Saturday morning in October to a neighborhood in Decatur, Georgia, where a man named Calvin Odom was standing in his own doorway watching his marriage drive away, and holding, without knowing it yet, everything he would ever need. Calvin Odom had lived on Briar Creek Road for 7 years, and in all that time he had never once seen a moving truck parked in front of his house. He stood in the doorway in a plain white t-shirt and work pants, a cup of coffee going cold in his left hand, and watched his wife choreograph the end of their marriage like she had been rehearsing it for months, because she had. The truck was bright orange. It was the kind you rented by the day, the kind people used when they were moving furniture across town, not the kind you needed for a marriage that was supposed to last a lifetime. But Priya had rented it anyway, and she had backed it up to the front walk with enough room for the whole street to see. Her mother, Nalini, stood on the lawn in a pressed silk blouse and dark slacks, pointing at boxes like she was directing a film set. She had driven 40 minutes from Buckhead at 8 in the morning on a Saturday, which told Calvin everything he needed to know about how long this day had been planned. Nalini did not do anything that was not planned. Her brother Raj was on the porch, filming with his phone, tilted sideways the way people do when they think they are capturing something worth showing the world. He was narrating in a half-whisper, something about upgrades, something about moving on up, and he smiled at his own joke in the way that only people who have never had to absorb real consequences can smile. And at the curb, engine still running, sat a dark green luxury sedan that Calvin did not recognize. The man behind the wheel did not get out. He did not turn the engine off. He just waited, hands on the wheel, sunglasses on, like his time was too valuable to spend standing on a sidewalk in Decatur. Calvin had never met Dr. Stephen Voss in person. But he knew the car. Priya had mentioned it once, the way people mention things they are not supposed to mention, and then moved on too quickly. The neighbors were watching. Calvin could feel it without looking. The Hendersons on the left had their front door cracked. Old Mr. Tillman across the street was sitting on his porch with his coffee the same way he did every Saturday, except this Saturday he was not reading his paper. And down near the corner, Sister Dorothy Watkins from Greater Vine Baptist stood at her mailbox with her hands folded in front of her, not checking anything, just standing there the way church women stand when they are witnessing something they will be praying about later. Priya came through the front door with a banker's box and handed it to Calvin without slowing down. "Your things," she said. "The important stuff." He looked down at the box. his grandfather's watch, a photograph of his mother, his work certifications in a manila envelope. She had decided what was important. She had sorted through his life and made decisions about what he would need going forward, and she had done it without asking him a single question. Then she held out a second envelope. Thin, legal size. His name typed on the front. "You'll want to have someone look at those," she said. "It's straightforward." Nalini stepped forward from the lawn, not because she needed to, but because she had something to say, and she had been saving it. "Calvin," she said, with the particular warmth of a woman who has never liked you, "maybe now you can find your level. There's nothing wrong with your level. It just was never going to be our level." She said it gently. That was the part that was meant to cut deepest. The gentleness. Like it was advice. Like she was doing him a kindness. Raj kept filming. Calvin did not say anything. He held the box and the envelope and stood in the doorway of his own house and said absolutely nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, but because his great-uncle Raymond Odom had raised him to understand that silence in the face of cruelty was not weakness. It was patience. And patience, Uncle Ray used to say, was just power waiting on the right moment. His right hand drifted to his jacket pocket the way it had every day for the past 8 months, and his fingers closed around the key ring before he even thought about it. 14 keys, brass, worn smooth in the places Uncle Ray had held them most, each one tagged with a small white label in Raymond's meticulous block handwriting. Calvin had been meaning to go through them since the funeral. He kept forgetting, or maybe he kept not being ready. He turned them over in his hand once while the truck was loaded, and the orange door came down with a metal clang that rang out across the whole street. Priya did not say goodbye. She walked to the sedan, and the door closed behind her, and the engine was already running. Calvin watched the truck pull away. He watched the sedan follow it. He watched until both turned the corner, and the street went quiet, with only Sister Dorothy still standing at her mailbox, watching him back with eyes that held something that looked like it might be an apology on behalf of the whole situation. Calvin looked down at the keys in his hand. This time he did not forget them. To understand what happened on that October morning, you have to go back further. You have to go back to where Calvin Odom came from and what kind of man he was before Priya's family ever had the chance to decide he wasn't enough. Calvin was Decatur born and Decatur raised. He grew up 3 blocks from the church his grandmother helped build, in a neighborhood where people left their screen doors unlocked until 9 at night, and everybody knew whose car was whose. His mother worked long hours and his father left early, and the man who filled that space was his great-uncle Raymond, a quiet, deliberate man who drove a 12-year-old Buick and owned more property than anyone in the family knew about. Uncle Ray taught Calvin 2 things above everything else. First, that a man's word was the only currency that never inflated, and second, that the most dangerous thing you could be was underestimated. Calvin went to trade school, not college, and the Krishnamurthy family never let him forget that distinction. He became a certified building manager at 24, the kind of man who knew every system in a structure. HVAC, electrical, plumbing, load-bearing walls. The kind of knowledge that keeps buildings standing but impresses nobody at a dinner party. He was good at his work. Genuinely good. But good at your work doesn't get you much credit when your in-laws have already decided what you are. He met Priya at a mutual friend's cookout in the summer, the kind of afternoon with loud music and somebody's uncle on the grill and children running between the legs of grown people. She was laughing at something when he first saw her, really laughing, and he thought that laugh was the most honest thing about her. He was right. It was. Everything else, it turned out, had been carefully arranged. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that Nalini managed like a production budget. Calvin's side of the church was smaller, louder, and ate more. Priya's side had better shoes. The reception was held at a venue in Buckhead that cost more than Calvin made in 4 months, and he paid his portion of it without complaint because he loved her and because he believed that love was a thing you demonstrated through action, not announcement. The Krishnamurthy family dinners started that first Christmas and never really stopped. Her father, Suresh, was a man who asked questions the way a contractor inspects a foundation, looking for cracks. He asked Calvin about his salary with the casual directness of someone who already knew the answer and found it insufficient. He asked about career plans with the patient disappointment of a man watching a horse that would never win. Nalini served everyone in a specific order that Calvin eventually recognized as a ranking system, and he was always last. The remarks were never loud. That was the thing about the Krishnamurthy cruelty. It was quiet, and it was constant, and it wore the clothes of polite conversation. Nalini once told Calvin in front of 4 people at a dinner table that she admired men who were content with simple lives. She said it warmly. She said it the way you'd say something kind. Calvin looked at his plate and said thank you, and reached for the bread, and heard Uncle Ray's voice in the back of his head, saying, "Patience, baby, patience." He brought Uncle Ray groceries every Sunday morning. That was the ritual. A brown paper bag from the good grocery store 2 neighborhoods over, the one that still carried the brand of hot sauce Raymond had been using since the 1970s. They would sit at the old man's kitchen table while Ray's gospel station played low on the radio and the coffee went strong and dark the way they both liked it. Ray never asked about the dinners, but sometimes he would look at Calvin with those careful eyes and say, "You still standing?" And Calvin would say yes. And Ray would nod and say, "That's enough for now." Calvin noticed Priya changing the way you notice weather, gradually, and then all at once. The hours got longer. The phone went face down on the counter. Plans got cancelled with reasons that were just slightly too smooth, too prepared. He noticed, but he did not chase. He was not built for accusations. He was built for patience and for watching, and so he watched, and he waited, and he told himself that sometimes marriages had seasons. Uncle Raymond Odom died on a Tuesday in February, quiet in his sleep, the way the righteous are said to go. He was 81 years old. He had never raised his voice in Calvin's memory. He had never wasted a word or a dollar or a single square foot of anything he owned. Calvin sat with the body for a long time before he called anyone. He was the sole heir. Everyone agreed it wasn't worth much. An old man's savings, maybe some furniture, a storage unit or 2. Priya said she was sorry for his loss and then mentioned a work obligation. She did not go to the funeral. She had a work event. Calvin sat in the front pew of Greater Vine Baptist and held a small Bible that had belonged to Raymond for 40 years, and when he opened it on the drive home, a business card fell into his lap. Hargrove and Associates, attorneys at law. A handwritten note on the back in Uncle Ray's block letters. Calvin, call them. It's time. He set the card on the kitchen counter when he got home. It sat there for 3 more months. But when he finally picked it up and dialed, the woman who answered said that a Mr. Harold Briggs had been trying to reach someone from the Odom estate for over a year and that he would very much like to meet. Hargrove and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street that smelled like old wood and serious money. Calvin arrived 10 minutes early in the same jacket he had worn to Uncle Ray's funeral, with the brass key ring in his pocket because it had been in his pocket every day for 2 weeks now, and taking it out felt wrong. The receptionist walked him to a conference room where 2 people were already waiting. The first was Gwendolyn Marsh. She was 50-something, silver-locked, and wore reading glasses pushed up on her head, like a woman who took them off to think and put them on to act. She had the stillness of someone who had spent 30 years delivering news that changed lives and had learned to let the information do its own work. She stood when Calvin entered, shook his hand with both of hers, and said she was glad he had called. The second person was Harold Briggs. He was older, 60-something, with the careful posture of a man who took his responsibilities seriously and the visible relief of someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time. He had driven in from Macon that morning. He had a leather portfolio in front of him, thick with folders, and when he saw Calvin, he exhaled in a way that was almost audible. "Your great-uncle was a remarkable man," Harold said. "I've been trying to reach the estate for 14 months. Gwendolen set a bound document on the table in front of Calvin. It was the kind of document that had tabs, a lot of tabs. She explained the structure first. Raymond Odom had established the Odom Medical Properties Trust in 1987, structured under Georgia trust law, with Calvin named as the sole successor beneficiary upon Raymond's death. The trust had been maintained, managed, and expanded continuously for 50 years. It had never been dissolved, never been contested, and never once been discussed at a family dinner. Then Harold opened his portfolio and began to walk Calvin through the inventory. The first property was a medical office complex in Macon that Raymond had purchased in 1989 for $240,000. The second was a surgical center outside Chattanooga, acquired in 1994. Then came a cluster of hospital-adjacent land parcels in Charlotte, a physician's campus in Savannah, outpatient facilities in Knoxville and Columbia, and Greenville. Harold turned pages steadily, his voice measured, his finger moving down each line like a man reading scripture. 31 properties in total. When Harold reached the final page of the inventory, Gwendolen slid a single sheet across the table. It had one number on it, $38.4 billion. Combined portfolio valuation as of the most recent independent appraisal, conducted 18 months prior. Calvin looked at the number. He did not say anything. He looked at it the way you look at something that your eyes understand before your mind does. Gwendolen gave him a moment. Then she continued. She told him about Greystone Medical Plaza, flagship property of the portfolio. 14-story medical office building in Fulton County, valued at $74 million, housing 22 tenants. The building had been fully leased for 11 consecutive years. Every tenant was current. Every lease was active, including, Gwendolen said, the practice occupying the building's most prestigious suite on the top floor. She said the name without particular emphasis. Voss Reconstructive Surgery. Lease rate, $18 per square foot. Current market rate for comparable space in Fulton County, $47 per square foot. The lease had been negotiated directly with Raymond's property management company in 2019 and had never been renegotiated. Monthly cost to the tenant, $14,400. What it should cost at market, $37,600. Calvin was still. Gwendolen told him about the change of ownership review clause. Standard language, she said, present in every Odom Trust lease since 1991. Upon transfer of principal ownership, all active leases entered a 60-day review period, during which terms could be renegotiated to current market rates. The clause had never been triggered, not once in 30 years. She paused. Then Harold reached for a second folder, thinner than the others, and set it on the table with the deliberate care of a man who understood what it contained. 3 land parcel deeds. Harold read the descriptions quietly. Parcel A, acquired 1991. Parcel B, acquired 1998. Parcel C, acquired 2003. He looked up at Calvin and said the name of the building those parcels sat beneath, Piedmont Regional Medical Center, 3 wings, the East Surgical Wing, the North Outpatient Pavilion, and the Central Administrative Annex. Piedmont Regional did not own that land. It had never owned that land. It leased it on 10-year terms, renewed twice without incident, from a trust whose principal had just changed hands. The silence in the room was complete. Calvin thought about the Thanksgiving table. He thought about Suresh asking Stephen about his practice with that warm, interested voice he had never once used with Calvin in 7 years. He thought about the moving truck and the orange door coming down and the sound it made. He thought about Uncle Ray at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning, coffee going dark, gospel radio low, saying, "You still standing?" Gwendolen folded her hands and asked how he would like to proceed. Calvin looked at the inventory one more time. Then he looked at Gwendolen. "How long would it take," he said, "to trigger the review clause on every property simultaneously?" Gwendolen Marsh had not smiled once since Calvin walked through the door. She smiled now. 60 days, she said. That's the legal minimum. They met 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Always at Gwendolen's office, always in the same conference room, always with Harold present, and the bound inventory open on the table between them like a map of territory Calvin was only beginning to understand he owned. The strategy took shape the way good plans do, not all at once but in layers, each decision building on the one before it, each move designed to be clean and legal and impossible to misread as anything other than standard trust administration. The first move was Greystone. Gwendolen explained the logic plainly. The change of ownership review clause applied to all 31 properties simultaneously, but the Greystone lease correction would be the most immediate and most personal consequence for Stephen Voss. His monthly occupancy cost would move from $14,400 to $37,600 in a single billing cycle. His practice overhead would triple overnight. He would have 60 days to accept the corrected terms or vacate the suite. There was nothing illegal about it. There was nothing retaliatory about it. It was the lease he had signed with the clause that had always been there, activated by an ownership event he had never anticipated, because he had never thought to ask who actually owned the ground beneath his ambitions. Calvin listened and nodded and said nothing extra. The second move was Piedmont Regional. Gwendolen would send formal written notification to the hospital's board of directors, informing them of the Odom Trust ownership transition and the pending review of the 3 land parcel lease agreements. The notification would trigger Piedmont's own internal institutional protocols, standard procedure for any hospital whose physical infrastructure was subject to a change in underlying land ownership. What those protocols uncovered once they started looking was not Calvin's concern. He was simply a new principle notifying a tenant of a change in ownership. That was all. That was enough. The third move was the one that gave the whole plan its shape. All 31 properties in the Odom Trust portfolio would receive simultaneous ownership transition notices on the same Tuesday morning, sent under the Odom Medical Properties Trust name alone. No individual, no Calvin Odom, no personal connection visible anywhere in the paperwork. The event would read as a routine administrative transition across a large medical real estate portfolio, not a targeted action against any single tenant, and certainly not a man settling a personal score. That was the elegance of it. Raymond had built something so large that one man's destruction inside it was simply a line item. Calvin told Gwendolen 2 things before they finished that session. First, his name stayed off all initial correspondence. Second, no leaks, no signals, no warnings, not to anyone. She said she understood completely. Outside of that office, Calvin moved through the next 2 weeks with the same quietness he had carried his whole life, except now the quietness had a different quality to it. It was not the quietness of a man absorbing. It was the quietness of a man who had already decided. He submitted his resignation from the building management company on a Monday morning. Standard 2 weeks' notice, professional language, no explanation beyond a career change. His supervisor shook his hand and said they'd miss him. Calvin thanked him and meant it. He moved out of the Decatur house on a Wednesday. He took what he needed, his clothes, his grandfather's watch, the photograph of his mother, Uncle Ray's old Bible, and left everything else. He had found a small apartment in East Atlanta, nothing notable, 2nd floor, good light in the mornings. He paid 3 months up front in cash, which made the landlord look at him twice. Calvin smiled and said he liked to keep things simple. He did not call Suresh. He did not call Nalini. He did not reach out to Raj, who had never once looked at him like he was worth looking at. He did not post anything. He did not explain anything to anyone. Priya sent him one text 11 days after the moving truck. It said, "Did you cancel the streaming account?" Calvin read it, set the phone down, and did not respond. There was nothing in him that wanted to. He spent those evenings at the apartment in a plain chair by the window, the brass key ring on the table in front of him, turning it in the lamplight the way Uncle Ray used to turn things over in his hands when he was thinking. 14 keys, 14 properties among the 31. Raymond had labelled each one himself in his block handwriting because Raymond trusted no system he had not personally organized. Calvin understood that now in a way he hadn't before. On the Tuesday morning at the end of that second week, he sat in Gwendolyn's office one final time before the letters went out. She had the stack on her desk, 31 certified envelopes, each one addressed to a different property management contact, each one carrying the same formal notification. She looked at Calvin and asked if he was ready. He said yes. She handed the stack to her assistant, who took them downstairs to the mail center. They were gone before 10 in the morning. Calvin drove back to East Atlanta, made a pot of coffee, and sat by his window with the key ring on the table and the sun coming through the glass the way it does on a clear fall morning in Georgia, steady and warm and entirely indifferent to everything happening beneath it. 4 days later, on a Thursday, a certified letter arrived at the Greystone Medical Plaza Management Office addressed to the tenant in Suite 1400. Stephen Voss signed for it himself. He called his accountant before he called his attorney, which told you everything you needed to know about what kind of man he was and what he thought the problem was. The problem was not the money. Day 4. Stephen's accountant came to the Greystone suite in person, which was the first sign that the numbers were bad enough to deliver face-to-face. He laid out the math on a single sheet of paper. Monthly occupancy at the corrected rate, $37,600. Current monthly occupancy, $14,400. Difference, $23,200 every month, starting in 60 days. Stephen stared at the sheet for a long time. Then he told the accountant there had to be a mistake. There was no mistake. Calvin was at his apartment when Gwendolyn called to confirm the notice had been received and signed for. He said thank you and set the phone down and poured himself a glass of water and stood at his kitchen window watching the street below. A woman was walking a dog. 2 kids were on bikes. The world was going about its business entirely unbothered. So was he. Day 9. Stephen applied for relocation financing at 3 separate lending institutions over the course of 5 days. He needed enough to cover first and last month's rent at a comparable Buckhead address, build-out costs for a new surgical suite, and operating reserves to bridge the gap while the practice restabilized. He presented himself the way he always did, polished, confident, the kind of man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. The first lender declined within 48 hours. The second declined the following day. The third took 3 days and then declined in a letter that used the phrase debt-to-income ratio 4 times. His practice expansion loan, already drawn against projected revenue that was now uncertain, had been flagged for technical review. The artificially low lease that had made his financial profile look healthy for years had done its job too well. The moment it was gone, the whole picture changed. Stephen had borrowed against a fiction. The fiction was over. Day 14. Piedmont Regional's Board of Directors received the Odom Trust Ownership Transition Notice by certified mail. The hospital's legal counsel reviewed it that afternoon and recommended immediate activation of standard institutional protocol for land lease uncertainty. By end of business, the Compliance Office had initiated a review of all senior privilege holders as part of routine risk assessment. Stephen Voss's file went to the top of the stack. Day 17. The billing audit took 3 days. It did not take long because the irregularities were not hidden particularly well. Over 34 months, the practice had submitted $1.8 million in upcoded reconstructive procedures, billing for complexity levels that the documented cases did not support. The compliance team flagged 41 specific claims. It was the kind of pattern that looks like an accident once. 41 times it looks like a decision. Stephen's surgical privileges at Piedmont Regional were suspended pending full investigation. The letter arrived at the Greystone suite on a Monday morning. Stephen read it, standing up, and did not sit down for a long time afterward. Day 19. His surgical schedule went dark. His office manager started making calls to patients, to referring physicians, to anyone who needed to know that upcoming procedures would need to be rescheduled. Two of his highest-profile patients, both of whom had been referred through a prominent Atlanta concierge medical group, transferred their care to a competing practice within 72 hours. They did not call Stephen first, they just left. Day 21. The editor at Atlanta Medical Monthly sent a brief email to his assistant. The feature on Stephen Voss, 3 months in development, 2 interviews already conducted, a photographer already booked, was being postponed indefinitely. The email did not say why, it did not need to. The assistant forwarded it to Stephen and did not follow up. Priya had given 2 interviews for that piece. She had picked her outfit for the photo. Day 24. The bank contacted Nalini Krishnamurthy directly. The $340,000 personal loan she had co-signed for Stephen's Buckhead apartment had been structured against his projected income. That income no longer existed in any verifiable form. The bank wanted to discuss the account. Nalini took the call in her kitchen, and when it was over, she sat at her table for a long time, with the phone still in her hand. Then she called Priya. Day 27. Whatever was said between Nalini and Priya in that phone call was enough that Nalini drove to the Buckhead apartment in person. She did not come inside. The conversation happened on the sidewalk in front of the building, in full view of the doorman and 2 residents who happened to be leaving at the same time. The neighbor who lived across the street from the Krishnamurthy family home later said it was the loudest thing she had heard on that block in 20 years. That same day, Raj deleted the moving day video from his Instagram without any caption or explanation. One moment it was there. Then it was not. Day 30. Stephen called Suresh Krishnamurthy and asked for help. The call lasted 4 minutes. After it ended, Stephen sat alone in Suite 1400 of Greystone Medical Plaza, the suite with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the Fulton County skyline that had once made him feel like the city was confirming something about him, and opened his laptop. He typed the words, Odom Medical Properties Trust, into the search bar. He read for a long time. He read about the portfolio. He read about the 31 properties. He read about the valuation, and then he found the registered agent information at the bottom of the trust's public filing, and he saw the name of the law firm, and he picked up his phone. The address was Hargrove and Associates on Peachtree Street. He called and asked to speak to someone about the trust. The assistant told him that the principal would be available for a meeting in 2 days. What Stephen did not know, could not have known, was that Calvin Odom had already been notified, that Calvin had already confirmed the time, that Calvin would already be seated in that conference room when Stephen walked through the door. He was already waiting. Calvin arrived at Hargrove and Associates 45 minutes early. He sat in the same conference room where he had first learned what Uncle Ray had left behind, in the same chair he had occupied that morning, and he was still. The bound inventory was not on the table this time. There was nothing on the table, just the clean surface of polished wood and the quiet of a room that knew how to hold serious things. Gwendolen came in at 5 minutes before the hour, set her folder down, and looked at Calvin the way she had looked at him since the beginning, with the steady professional regard of someone who had done this work for a long time and recognized in this particular man something worth respecting. She did not ask if he was ready. She could see that he was. They heard the elevator before they heard the voices. Stephen's voice carried first, that particular register of a man performing composure for an audience of one, talking to Priya in the hallway in the clipped, controlled tone of someone who had rehearsed what he planned to say in this room. Then the door opened, and he came through it with the posture of a surgeon who expected the world to make room. He stopped. The sight of Calvin Odom sitting at the head of that table, in plain clothes, no briefcase, no performance, just a man at rest in a chair that turned out to be his, hit Stephen like a physical thing. The composure flickered, only for a second, but it flickered. Priya came through the door behind him and went completely still. The silence lasted long enough to mean something. Gwendolen broke it in her precise, unhurried way. She introduced Calvin fully, his full name, his title. Principal of the Odum Medical Properties Trust, sole heir of Raymond Odum, legal owner of the portfolio that included Greystone Medical Plaza and the land parcels beneath 3 wings of Piedmont Regional Medical Center. She said it the way you read a verdict, clearly, without inflection, without mercy. Stephen found his footing faster than Priya did. That was the thing about men like him. The professional language came back quickly when the personal ground gave way. He sat down without being invited to, folded his hands on the table, and began to speak about the least dispute in the tone of a man who believed that framing something as a business matter made it one. He made an offer. A number, a timeline, a proposed renegotiation schedule. He used words like mutually beneficial and good faith resolution. He looked at Gwendolen when he said them, not at Calvin, because looking at Calvin required acknowledging what Calvin was in that room. Calvin let him finish. He let every word land and settle and sit there in the air between them. He did not rush. He did not interrupt. He waited until Stephen had said everything he had prepared to say, and then he waited a little longer, and then he spoke. He spoke quietly. He told Stephen about the keys first, about how he had been carrying 14 keys on a brass ring in his jacket pocket for 8 months because his great-uncle Raymond had died and left him an estate that everyone in that family had decided was worthless. He described each key the way Uncle Ray had labelled them, in block handwriting, meticulous, 1 tag per key, every property accounted for. He said Priya had called Raymond a hoarder. He said her mother had called him eccentric. He said her brother had called him a relic, and then filmed himself celebrating the end of their marriage on a public platform for the world to see. Stephen started to say something. Calvin raised one hand, barely, and Stephen stopped. Calvin talked about the Thanksgiving table, about sitting at the far end while Stephen Voss name-dropped Piedmont Regional and talked about his Buckhead address and accepted the warmth of a family that had never once offered Calvin that same warmth in 7 years of showing up, paying his portion, attending every dinner, absorbing every remark. He talked about the moving truck and the orange door and the box of his belongings that Priya had pre-packed because she had already decided what his life was worth taking. He talked about the profile piece that was supposed to run in Atlanta Medical Monthly, the one Priya had given 2 interviews for, the one that would have put Stephen's name and face in front of every medical professional in the city. He talked about the diplomas on the walls of Suite 1400, about the surgery suite at Piedmont where Stephen had built his reputation procedure by procedure, patient by patient, billing irregularity by billing irregularity, on land that Raymond Odum had purchased in 1991 and held without announcement for 30 years. Then Calvin looked directly at Priya for the first time since they had entered the room. "You called my Uncle Ray a hoarder," he said. "You filmed yourself leaving my house like it was a victory lap, and your brother put it on the internet. What you didn't know, what none of you ever thought to ask, was that every morning Stephen walked into that beautiful office and felt like a man. He was walking into Raymond Odum's building. Every surgery he performed at Piedmont that made him feel important, he was standing on Raymond Odum's land, and Raymond Odum left all of it to me." The room was absolutely silent. Stephen had no offer left. The professional language had gone somewhere he could not reach it. He sat with his hands still folded on the table, and the folded hands were the only composed thing left about him. Priya began to cry. Not dramatically, quietly, the way things fall apart when there is nothing left to perform for. Calvin did not look at her. He did not offer comfort, and he did not withhold it as punishment. He simply did not acknowledge it, because there was nothing left between them that required his acknowledgement. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He told Gwendolen he would be in touch about the portfolio review schedule and that she had his number. He walked to the door and he did not look back. Not once. The October sun hit him full in the face when he stepped out of the building onto Peachtree Street, warm and indifferent and bright, the way Atlanta sun is in the fall. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the air and felt something that was not quite peace and not quite satisfaction, but was close to both. The particular feeling of a long-held thing finally set down. He called no one. He walked to his car, drove home to East Atlanta, and made coffee. The lease vacate notice for Suite 1400 at Greystone Medical Plaza was filed by Gwendolen's office the following morning at 9 o'clock. 6 months later, the billing investigation at Piedmont Regional Medical Center reached its conclusion. Stephen Voss's surgical privileges were permanently revoked. The $1.8 million in upcoded procedures had been thoroughly documented. 41 claims, 34 months, a pattern too consistent and too profitable to be anything other than intentional. His medical license entered a formal review period with the Georgia Composite Medical Board. His attorneys issued a statement. Nobody reprinted it. The Buckhead apartment was surrendered at the end of the month. The $340,000 loan that Nalini had co-signed was restructured under terms that cost her more than the original amount would have. Stephen moved out quietly, without the moving truck, without the filming, without any audience at all. Priya moved back into her parents' home in Buckhead. She was 36 years old and sleeping in the room she had grown up in, and the silence in that house was a different kind of silence than the one she had left behind on Briar Creek Road. Nalini did not speak to her for 4 months. Not coldly, not cruelly, just the absence of words, which was its own verdict. Raj's social media went private sometime in November. He never explained why. He did not need to. Calvin heard about most of this through Gwendolen, who kept him informed as a matter of professional duty and delivered the updates in the same measured tone she used for everything else. Calvin received each piece of information the same way, with a nod, and then a question about something else, something related to the portfolio or the foundation or the next item on the agenda. He did not celebrate. He did not revisit it. He had said what needed to be said in that conference room, and everything that came after was simply the world settling into the shape it should have been in all along. The Raymond Odom Community Health Access Foundation was incorporated in December, 4 weeks after the confrontation. Calvin worked with Harold and Gwendolen to structure it carefully. A portion of the trust's annual rental income redirected to fund free and below-market medical office space for underserved clinics in Decatur, Vine City, and Mechanicsville. The communities Raymond had bought land in when everyone else was leaving. The communities that had always needed what those buildings could provide and had never been able to afford the asking rate. Harold Briggs became the foundation's first operations director. He drove in from Macon on his first day with a thermos of coffee and his leather portfolio and sat down at his desk like a man who had been waiting for exactly this work his whole career. Calvin shook his hand and told him Uncle Ray had chosen well. Calvin bought a house in January, 3 blocks from where he grew up, in a neighborhood where people still left their screen doors unlocked until 9 at night. It was modest, 3 bedrooms, a good porch, hardwood floors that creaked in the back hallway like an old church door. He paid cash. He planted something in the yard in the spring and did not tell anyone what it was. He was at Greater Vine Baptist most Sunday mornings in a pew near the middle, and Sister Dorothy Watkins from down the street had taken to saving him the seat on the aisle because she said he was always the first one who needed to get to the door to hold it open for the older members. She was not wrong. He met Diane at a foundation board meeting in March. She was the grant writer. brought in on a recommendation from a non-profit in Vine City. And she asked better questions in that first meeting than most people asked in 3. She wanted to know why the Foundation's service radius had been drawn the way it had, and when Calvin explained it, she listened the way people listen when they are actually thinking about what you are saying and not just waiting to respond. She laughed at something he said near the end of the meeting that he had not intended to be funny, and it turned out she was right, that it was. They talked in the parking lot for 20 minutes after everyone else had left. He did not ask for her number that day. He thought about it for 2 weeks and then he did. She was quietly funny and genuinely curious, and she asked good questions about everything, not just the work. She did not perform anything. She was simply herself, which turned out to be more than enough. Uncle Ray never announced what he was building. He just kept building. He bought land in places people were fleeing, and he held it with patience that most people would have called stubbornness, and he labeled every key on a brass ring in his own handwriting because he trusted no system he had not personally organized. He left it all to a quiet man from Decatur who had learned, from watching Raymond, that the most dangerous thing you could be in this world was underestimated by people too busy performing their own importance to pay attention to what was actually being built around them. Some people spend their whole lives performing success for an audience that isn't paying attention. Raymond Odom paid attention to the land. And on a Tuesday evening in April, Calvin Odom locked up the Greystone Medical Plaza management office, turned off the lights, and walked to his car in the parking structure that Uncle Ray had owned since 1994. He had the brass key ring in his hand. All 14 keys, each one still tagged in Raymond's block handwriting, worn smooth in the places the old man had held them most. Calvin ran his thumb across one of the tags the way he had every day for months now, feeling the letters in the dark. Then he put them in his pocket and drove home. Now I want to ask you something. If you had been in Calvin's position, if you had been standing in that doorway holding those keys, watching that truck pull away, what would you have done? Would you have walked away, quietly, the way Calvin did? Or would you have done something entirely different? Let me know your honest answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story moved you the way I hope it did, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because we have more stories coming that you do not want to miss. I will see you in the next one.